Hi there, thanks for joining me for this quite informal walkthrough of one of our manual handling risk assessment example templates that we have. Hopefully this will be useful for you just to go through some of the detail that we would go into in a typical manual handling risk assessment. This one's related to pushing and pulling. As we touched on previously, manual handling itself, you may already know, is usually split out into different types of handling, such as repetitive movements, lifting and carrying, or as I was saying, pushing and pulling, which is what we're going to look at in this one. So it's going to be very informal, as I said, a wee bit off the cuff. Let us know if you like the format. As I said, this is very informal. It means that I can get this done quickly for you, have a chat through some of the key elements in the document. I'm not going to go through every single detail, but hopefully you'll get a feel for the types of elements and salient points that we'd look at and include in this type of assessment. So that's it for now. As I say, if you do like it, please click the like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Let's crack on and look at the document. Okay then, let's look at this example here. I'm not going to touch on every section on the template. If you do want to slow it down and look at any of the sections in more detail, obviously you can do that with the video. But I want to show you at least a piece of each of the sections just to show you the flavour of what exactly we're including in it and the type of things that would go towards creating this manual handling risk assessment. So as you can see, this is a pushing and pulling assessment example that we have here. We have designated at the top that this is a generic assessment, so it applies to multiple tasks. In other words, it's not specific to just one unique task. And that's something you can include or not, depending on what you're looking at. Other things in this introductory section at the top are things like the load weight and the trolley weight, or the item weight itself. In this case, you can see that is 300 kgs for the trolley, and the load, or the safe working load of the trolley, is 300 kilograms as well. So in total, that's 600 kgs, as you can see here. It also includes operational frequency here and a little bit about the push and pull distance. So the maximum distance one of your pushing and pulling operations would travel, essentially, which is 150 meters by means of example here. Okay. So a couple of other little line items there. We'll not get into too much detail on those. The first section is a bit of a descriptive section. Firstly, just describing the actual task. As you can see here, we're talking about the movement of a loaded trolley carrying large metal fabricated materials through from an unloading area to a drop-off area, and it's approximately 150 meters. It's typically conducted by 2 employees. What else can we see there? Okay, the risk assessment covers just the points from A to B, and explaining a bit about what that process looks like. The rest of it there, just covering a bit more about what that process looks like. As you can see, we have an image of the typical piece of equipment, the trolley or stillage that we would use, and what we're actually assessing here. In the right hand side, you might have already noticed this little diagram or drawing that's been sketched out on the computer here, just as an example of what you might want to put in to give a visual representation of your traveling route for this manual handling operation. This is very simplistic. If you were doing it on a piece of paper, you could sketch it, of course, but it's just a useful thing for anyone that would be reading it or explaining it just to people as to where you're going from A to B and what sort of obstructions or the route channels, what they look like. As you can see, there's a little bit of descriptive in there as well. The end of this assessment there, you're not going to be able to fill that out until you actually do the assessment. So that is going to designate the assessment of the risk of injury being low, medium or high, which of course you can put in as a traffic light color there just to make it obvious to whoever's reading it. And that's just put in high as an example for you. The next section then is section B, and this is when you want to do a more detailed qualitative assessment for something that I guess might be complicated or complex enough with enough risk in it that justifies you going into the minutiae of detail in each sort of aspect of the task. So again, this would be, I would say, optional depending on what you're doing, but our template, as you can see, gives you the option to go into detail, and we've sort of scripted out some rough examples here in this for you. Just to break down the sections quickly for you and give you an example, the first part, as you can see, is task involvement, which just relates to what does the task involve. In other words, generically, what type of movement is it? What type of pushing or pulling operation is it? It breaks the questions down essentially, or the areas that may be of risk for you. So looking at things like the necessary force that's required, are there any sudden movements needed? Is there any twisting or maneuvering of the load when you're conducting the operation, and so forth? If you look at the twisting and maneuvering the load into position, as an example. So as you can see here, somebody's denoted this as being a high risk. So what does that mean? This little section here explains the problems from that particular element according to this operation. So as we can see here, if you want to have a read at it, it's talking about how we need to maneuver the trolley as we're approaching or coming from our drop-off point into the factory, and having to perform turns and so forth. So obviously with a heavy piece of equipment or an object loaded onto a heavy object loaded onto a trolley, having to maneuver these things is going to put additional strain on the person. So that's what's being described here. And then in the other section, we talk about what remedial or control measures we might want to think about, or that are in place already to mitigate the actual risk. In the right hand side then, that's the section you want to put in your control measures or remedial actions. So here, by means of example, you can see it's saying about keeping the route clear, minimizing the amount of traffic to allow the momentum to continue when the trolley is moving along, and shifting direction and so on. Obviously, we will want to think about the risk to pedestrians that are walking around that sort of heavy load being pushed along a shop floor or warehouse as well. So that's something else to bear in mind. So that's kind of the format of that. You sort of describe what your problems are, what your control measures or remedial actions are, and then you'll see further on down where you would then list the outcomes of that qualitative assessment. As you can see here, it breaks down into different sections: load or object to be moved. So that looks at the actual object itself and the characteristics of it, whether it's straightforward, it's always the same size, shape, etc., or whether there's any unstable or unpredictable characteristics, or the weight distribution, for example, of it. Just depends on of course what you're dealing with. In many different environments, this will vary. So the assessment then goes on, talks about working environment. As you can see here, there are some examples of things like constraints on your body posture or positioning. So are you contained or confined in an area, depending on the route of travel, for example? What are the floor surfaces like? Are there any ramps or uneven surfaces that you have to deal with? And a lot of this part of the assessment is looking at the external environment and what goes on around the load itself, looking more so at the movement of the people that are actually carrying it out and the environment around them. So if it is an assessment that you're looking at that you think has a lot of those more external risks, I would say, to your actual specific manual handling, pushing and pulling itself, then it may be justified to at least take some of these sections and use them. But of course, you could develop a risk assessment like this in whichever way you want. It's not strictly required that any of these sections or all of them should be included, and that should be entirely up to whomever is doing the assessment, and just making sure that it's appropriate and relevant. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, and we'll move on to the next section then, which just summarizes. This would summarize the outcomes of your qualitative assessment there. So after all of that discussion, you would talk about the control measures and remedial actions that you're wanting to do, and then you would list them there just to summarize them and make it easy for reference purposes what actions need to be taken as a result of that part of the assessment. Moving on from that then is the part of the assessment that I would say we always have in the assessment. Even if we're doing a simple version, we want to perform this scoring exercise. So what we've done here is we've taken some of the guidance from the HSE in Great Britain, as we may have mentioned earlier, I've mentioned in previous videos, and used their criteria to basically create a scoring system for the pushing and pulling and different types of manual handling exercises. That's easy to go through. As you can see here, it's broken down into nine component parts, I think it is, which each have scoring criteria that you can select, and we'll look further into that as we go down. Once we score all of those sections, we list all of the scores and color code them here in this section. So as you can see, from 1 to 9 here, that's all listed. Some examples there on the right hand side. You can see high risk and low risk in the red and green respectively. So just to give you an idea of where that scoring comes from, this is where the HSE's guidance I think is really helpful, and we've adopted and adapted for our use here. So let's take an example of it. If we were looking at, this looks like a lot of information. Basically what it is each of these scoring sections of the 9 sections I just looked at is broken down into a little explainer as to how you should think and what you should think about when you're scoring it. So we'll take posture as an example, as a simple example here, number 2. If we scroll back up to our scoring assessment, you can see posture is here. And our scores are good, reasonable or poor, starting from 0 for good, 3 for reasonable and 6 for poor. So the higher score means the higher risk and the worse the control measures that are in place, in other words. So if we go back down here, if we were to score 0, if we're looking at the posture for a particular assessment, what we'll be looking for is that the torso is largely upright, is not twisted, and that the hands are between shoulder and hip height. So you can see here in this little diagram, little pictures on the right hand side, it shows you what good looks like, and it also shows you what bad looks like. So what we'll be doing in this instance is thinking about our trolley operation and thinking about the posture that the operators are having to maintain when they're performing that operation. If, as it shows in the pictures here, there are handholds or areas to grip on in between shoulder and hip height, and the operators are able to stand upright with a fixed torso position without too much twisting and turning throughout the operation, we may want to score it a 0, and that would be a positive result for us. If that wasn't the case, if it was too cumbersome or heavy and they were having to do all this sort of stuff on the right, we may want to rate it a 6. So you go through that for each of those 9 elements. I'm not going to go through each of them individually. They are sort of self-explanatory once you would look through the descriptions and the visuals on them. But that helps you to come up with your scores here. So in this case, for example, we've scored posture as a red in this operation, but that's not to say that what I described is high risk. But essentially you would have your 1 to 9 scores. At the end you would have a score total, which you could rank as high, medium or low risk, and that allows you then to compare it to different assessments that you've done, and you can actually prioritize where you put your resources in terms of trying to improve and reduce risk. And also it helps you to highlight where your high risk areas are. So that's kind of a quick run through of how this typical assessment and pushing and pulling risk assessment would be done. And that's the detailed version. We're not going to go through that in, as I say, any more detail than what I've just done. Hopefully that's helpful in some way just to see how that might be set up. If you thought that example was particularly useful and relevant for you, we do have that example available as a template download as well, and I'll leave some links for you for that. And also, please remember, you can go on to safety.com and avail of our free manual handling training, which I'll drop a link to at the end of this. So once again, please do let us know if you like this format of looking at a risk assessment, albeit I didn't go into huge detail in the specific circumstances, but if you like this sort of informal chat through and you found it valuable, please do let us know in the comments or by clicking the like button. because I would love to develop and produce more of these if you do find it useful. Okay, that's it for this one. Thank you for joining me, and hopefully we'll see you again.